So for the folks who are listening to the recording, hi everybody. This is critiquing your own work, and I think it's a really important topic. To improve our work, and hopefully through the presentation you'll get some ideas on how to look at your own work, how to be a little bit more objective and remove some of the emotion, and pick the images that you want to display to the outside world, or just be happy with your own work too. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. And I was super bummed. Let me figure this out. I was super bummed that we had some of the cancellations with the camera clubs this week, but I am very excited for two reasons. One, to figure out the webinars. The webinars is actually something I've wanted to do for some time. I just really haven't had time to do it. And also I've been able to update the presentation. So yeah, hopefully you guys will see some new stuff here. So with that, let me see. Hopefully you guys can see this. How can I tell if you guys can see this? Let me go back to, where did you guys go? Okay, hang on. Okay, perfect. You guys can see it. Okay, I'm gonna do it again. Thank you. Thank you. Perfect. Okay. Okay, so I thought it would be fun to sort of a preemptive strike to just talk a little bit about my keep ratio. How many images do I keep once I go out and photograph? So you know, I love spreadsheets actually as much as I love bubbles. So we're going to start with a spreadsheet. So this is an analysis of last year's shoots, and you can see I've had a bunch of different ones. Last year I took about 25,000, 26,000 images, and you can see that my keep ratio is about 2.73%, not quite 3%. And I define keepers by images that I'm really excited about, personally, images that I feel express what I want them to express, and images that I'll use for public consumption. So that means I'll send them to magazines, I'll use them for a blog post, I'll put them on social media, I'll use them for calendars. They go out into the world in some way, shape, or form. So that my keep ratio, I keep about 3% of the images that I take, and it's a good thing that we don't track batting averages, because I don't even know that I'd make it in the major league with that batting average. So super glad nobody asks about this, but there's Ansel Adams to the rescue. He said that 12 significant photographs in any 1 year is a good crop, and well, at 705, you know, that's not too bad, right? Well, so what I want to talk about in the presentation is how do we decide on what we keep and what we don't. And for those of you who are over analytical, like I am, this is your time to rejoice. Critiquing our work is a way to constructively, subjectively review our photographs, and it gives us with as much objectivity as possible. Of course, there's technical things that we can be looking for, and critique for me is a really important of being a photographer, because it helps us understand our habits, it understands our preferences, and it helps for me build my individual style. And so not only when I critique my own work, but when I'm with you guys in workshops and I'm critiquing your work, I'm polishing my own style as well, and as you are, by looking at the image and asking myself how I would do it differently if that were my situation, if that was my, you know, my cards that had been dealt to me, what would I do with them? I think critique is a really good time to also be optimistic and positive with yourself. You know, critique, we tend to think that, you know, we're going to be talking about things we don't like. I think it's also equally as important to talk about the things that we do like, because we want to emphasize those. We want to keep doing those things over and over again, things that are helping us. So with critique, we take the good, we take the bad, we take all of these, and we get new ideas for moving forward. So critiquing your work, if you've never done a critique before, it's not a scary thing. It's just an opportunity to ask ourselves what we like about it and what we don't like about it. And in my opinion, every image can be changed somehow. It doesn't necessarily mean that's for the better. It's obvious, especially if we're critiquing at home or we're critiquing at a workshop after the fact, it's really hard for us to change the past. We can't go back to that situation and get the exact same lighting conditions and the same exact, waves or whatnot. But we can get ideas for next time. I think it's important as we critique our own work and each other's to note that everybody sees differently. So even in the presentation today, I'm going to be talking about some of the decisions that I made with my own work and trying to understand what it is I would do differently. And so you might see it differently. You may have different answers, and that's okay. Everybody sees differently. So polish your own style. As I go through the presentation, ask yourself what you like about the image and what you don't. Kind of stay with me, because that's going to help you with your critiquing skills. So for me, critiquing is all about avoiding the all fun, fabulous spray and pray. So spray and pray is where you make a bunch of images and you pray one comes out. Now, when you're in the field, we don't want to be guessing. In the field is where we can fix all of our technical problems, and so we don't want to be in the field being like, well, I think I think I got it. I'm not sure. And so we want to make really deliberate choices based on our intent, and I'll talk us through what that means here in a little bit. But I do my critique in the field. So I'm looking at technical aspects that we'll go through today very closely to make sure that I have the very best image I can out of the camera so that when I come home, my processing steps help me polish that into the vision that I want. I'm not fixing things in Photoshop, for example. I do, however, continue my evaluation at home. And there are things when I get home, I say, you know what, I liked it in the field, but just didn't work out for me. And I think I want to adjust for it. And that's okay. That's okay too. The thing is I joke about spray and pray, but when you look at my batting average, 2.73%, nobody asks me about that, right? I mean, nobody looks at my image and says, oh, did you take 4,000 images? Yeah, I might have actually, and if I'm photographing waves in Acadia, yeah, probably. Yeah, if I get something exciting like bubbles, yeah, I probably did take 4,000 pictures. The key here is the word deliberate. Make as many frames as you need in the field, but try to learn from each and every single one of them. So with that, yeah, no spray and pray, none of that stuff. Okay, so the most important question for me in a critique to start is, did what I see and experience come out of the camera? And one note here that I'll make about the presentation is you're gonna see a lot of images from Death Valley. I've done that on purpose. I've picked out images from a variety of shoots. This is gonna be more realistic. We're gonna come home with a bunch of images from one place, and we're gonna try and figure out what to do with them. So I've chosen all of Death Valley on purpose to keep our critique somewhat realistic. But the question is did I see and what I saw and what I experienced, did it come out of the camera? And so for me, in order to know did what I see and experience up there, I need to know what that is. I need a starting place, a foundation for all of my decisions. And so I develop my visual message first. And what that means is that I'm going to take the time to look around. I'm going to be mindful. I'm going to take inventory of what exists. Some of you may have heard the words, somebody may have told you to slow down. For those of you who know me personally, I am not a slow person. So slowing down made me crazy. But I can be mindful. I can just be mindful fast. I'm very mindful of, I'm looking at, the water, I'm looking at the foliage, I'm looking at what's happening with the sky, and I'm trying to take inventory of what's happening, what's coming together, what relationships are happening between different visual elements, and I'm asking what I'm responding to. And this is just paying attention to yourself. This is just paying attention to what it is you're responding to. What are you getting excited about here? What is it? Sometimes I have a really hard time, especially when we've got a scene that's so overwhelmingly huge, or things are happening really fast, sometimes I have trouble nailing that down. And so I use words. I write, so it's easier for me to sort of verbally express myself as opposed to just go straight to visual. And so what you can do, I try to title my photograph before I shoot it. I don't always do it, but I do a fair bit of the time. And what that does is that gives me a starting place for all of my decisions. Because what we're going to be doing with a critique is we're going to be asking ourselves what we like about the photograph, and we're going to keep it and emphasize it, and we're going to ask ourselves what we don't like about the photograph, and we're going to get rid of that. And if we don't know really where we're going, these questions can be a little bit hard to answer. One of the things that I want to really emphasize in this part is you have to get specific. You have to be very specific about what it is you like and what you don't like. We can't, it's much harder to start from, well, I just don't like anything about the photograph. Well, that might be true and you should start over. But there's something in there that caused you to react to the outside world and you made the decision to make a photograph. So there's something in there. There's something in that photograph that you do like somehow. And we just need to pull that out. Sometimes it's like I just don't like it. I don't like it. I just don't know what it is, but I don't like it. We have to figure out what that is, and that takes some time. You just have to get used to picking apart the different elements, and hopefully this presentation will give you some ideas on what to pick on. So I was in Death Valley and I had a scene. This is at Zabriskie Point. Some of you have been there, you'll recognize it. And the next three images are kind of interrelated. I had three really to pick from. And it was like, okay, well, which one do I pick? Which one do I choose to show to the outside world? Which one do I like best? And again, it goes back to developing that visual message. What I was really responding to in this scene was just the kiss of light on the bottom right-hand corner, right at the top of the peak, and then the reflected light right just to the left of it, almost in the center of the image here. And I made a frame, I made a much tighter frame and then decided to go a little bit wider. You'll see the tighter frame in a second. But in this photograph, when I took this, I looked at it and I was like, I wanted to like it, and I didn't. And what was happening in this scene for me, there were a number of things. We have some symmetrical balance where we have a sort of division line right across the center of the frame, and that was dividing the frame. But more importantly, we had a number of visual elements that were competing for attention. So we had a dominance problem. If my eye wants to go to this peak here on the right hand side, my eye is being distracted by the light in the background. And so what I tried to do in the next frame was try to minimize that, get rid of that so it wasn't as distracting. And then when I photographed that, I realized that what I was again really wanting to emphasize was that relationship between the light on the peak and the light in the background, not so much the light on the background. And so when you have objects that are close to each other and they're similar in tonality, like the lighting is in this top half of the frame, they're going to be visually grouped together. And the relationship for me was really between the peak and the reflection. It had nothing to do with that background. So this might have been a right answer if I wasn't, really honed in on that relationship. But I really wanted to get to this point. And so this is the image that I ended up keeping out of the three. And I think the message here when you're looking at your image, keep things simple. The whole KISS, keep it simple, silly. Keep it simple and just fill your frame with your visual message. Again, that requires you to have that visual message first. You have to understand what it is you're going for before you know how to simplify. And that's really when you have the visual message, all this becomes is getting rid of the distractions, getting rid of these different elements. So with this scene, for me, this one worked best because of the simplicity, and it really emphasized the relationship that I wanted to showcase. So the next questions I'm asking myself when I'm out in the field doing my critique is the subject placement appropriate for the message that I want to share? And here's a sequence of 3 different images out in Panamint Springs. They're same visual elements, they're just arranged differently. And I'm no doubt you've heard of the rule of thirds. I don't adhere to the rule of thirds necessarily. I practice sort of Gestalt psychology and incorporating Gestalt psychology into my compositions. If I know how people are going to perceive my image, then I will position things on purpose so that they tend to feel what I'm feeling when I'm experiencing that moment out in the field. And so some of you I know have seen this, but for those who haven't, there's an experiment done in the 1960s where they tested perception of black dots, black discs in different parts of a square, different parts of the frame. And they asked viewers in the experiment if these discs had any visual force. Were they moving? And if so, how fast and in what direction? And on the screen, you can see there's a summary of the different, the results here. And I'm going to overlay the rule of thirds because this is what we understand universally. Things that are in the center of the frame, people perceive that disk and the objects that we put in the center of the frame to be at rest. They're not moving really fast. So if we have subject matters that we want to convey are at peace, they're stable, they're not moving, we would put them in the center of the photograph on purpose. If we want to convey a little bit more energy, we would put them at these intersection points, this box here, if you will, the blue box, where the black magnetic disks appear to be moving at equal rate in and out of the frame, especially at the top part of the frame. You can see sort of the longer lines coming out of there. This is so funny. So I got to pause for a minute. I'm pointing at the screen as if you guys can see me pointing at the screen. So I hope you guys could see this. But anyway, so if you want to create a little bit more energy, dynamic movement, you would put it in this rule of thirds box, if you will, sort of a little bit further out from the center of the screen, from the center of the frame. We have discs on the outside of the frame. People perceive those to be moving away from things, and so out of the frame. They're going to have increased energy away from something. And so when we are thinking about, you know, is my subject positioned properly, we really have to use these. This is what I use to decide where I position my things. The other thing that we want to be concerned with is relationships between different objects. Again, we talked about proximity a little bit earlier. Things that are grouped together will feel as if they're working together. They'll be more intimate. So I want to go back to those 3 images and talk through each one of them and what works and what doesn't work. So in this image, we have the happy, hopeful sunburst on the right, and we've got sort of this dead or at least drying shrub in the foreground here. And what I really wanted to showcase was the juxtaposition. There is a little bit of an energy, a balance between, you know, life and death and hope and despair. And so I really wanted to showcase that relationship between these two. Obviously, this bush in the front is not moving really fast. And so for me, I felt like I really wanted to center it. And I experimented, as you saw earlier, with moving the sun around in different positions. So in this case, we have the relationship between the foreground and the background, but it's just kind of it's kind of a two-directional balance. There's really not much else going on in the frame. And we contrast that with the next one. We got this. I moved over. So here I'm a little bit to the left, and now I've moved, well, let's see. I'm over to the left, and now I move a little bit to the right to shift the relationship between the 2 different visual elements, and things got a little better. And one thing that we've got still the relationship between the sun and the bush, but we also picked up another subtle line here. This little track kind of going off to the right is a little bit lighter in tonality than its surrounding, and so it picks up our eye a little bit. We've got a visual anchor in the background with some of the more bushes back there. And then we have sort of this triangle. So we've got, since the eye goes to the brightest part of the frame, we've got this triangle. But if you take a look at the shape of the triangle, For me, the image felt really unbalanced. So I kept, this bush in the foreground sort of centered, but you can see that there's sort of this unequal spacing, and for me that was just weird. I didn't care for the balance of that at all. You can see that the triangle is not really using a whole lot of the frame, and so I decided to move to the right. And when I moved to the right, I lined everything up in the middle. And that is going to, I'm going to talk about lines here in a little bit in a second. But this created a very static sort of feel. There was still the relationship between the bush and the sun, but the image just didn't carry the visual message that I was hoping for. And so I moved sort of in between. Oh yeah, and the line, that subtle line that we had off to the in the previous image, started going out of the frame. And that's not good. Well, I'll talk about lines in a minute. We want to keep the eye in the frame. And so I didn't really want that path going out that way. And so what I ended up doing was this. I ended up getting a little bit closer and centering the bush. And if you can see on the chart or the graph on the left, the illustration on the left, you can see that this visual element does not have a lot of movement, and I didn't want to convey a whole lot of movement. But the sun carries a little bit more of the energy, that hopefulness that I was hoping for. So we still have that relationship. That line, that really fun little subtle line that I was talking about, is now positioned well, and we've got a triangle that's much more balanced than in the previous frames. So in this case, I'm in the field, I'm asking myself what I like about it, what I don't like about it, and then I'm physically moving left or right. I mean, you're talking, a couple of inches, and it changes the composition entirely. So since we've talked about lines, we're kind of hinting on lines. Lines help us show depth. They help us direct the viewer in the frame, and give almost like a path for a viewer to walk in and around our photograph. And what we hope for is that the line pays off somewhere, and that somewhere should be in the frame. It should be a bright object, it should be a center of interest, it should help contribute to the rest of the frame, give context to the rest of the frame. And like I've already mentioned, moving left or right can really make a huge difference when you're out in the field. And so, it's a lot harder to fix a line in Photoshop later when you're at home, 2,000, 3,000 miles away. So I'm in the field, I'm asking, where are my lines going? And so uh, in this case, I've got a line here. I'll get back to lines have feelings in a second. We have a line coming in, and you can see that there's sort of a squiggle line from the right going around, but we have a little bit of a problem. It ends up crashing into this sort of kind of mid-tone space. It doesn't really go anywhere. And so while we have this image where we've got, sort of this meandering line adding to a little bit of peace, and we've got a direct line coming off to the left. For me, the image was less successful than I hoped for, and I'll show you an example of a more successful image, at least in my mind, in just a second. So before I go on though, lines do have feelings too, and what we want to do is match whatever our visual message is. What are we responding to, and why? Are we responding to the peacefulness of the place? Are we responding to the power, the energy? What is it that we're really responding to? And we can match lines as we see them out in the field. Obviously, we're not going to be able to, straighten this line out to the right here from this angle, but if we moved up to where the lines intersect, you would get a much straighter line, and you would convey a very different message than the one that I've conveyed here. So yeah, the problem with this one is that we crashed into this back wall, and we don't like crashing in our images. We want to move the eye around a lot. So in this image, what I did is I waited just a little bit for a little bit better light. And this is what transpired. And for me, this is an image that I feel a lot better about. We still have lines. We still have the lines coming in. We've got a little bright spot where the lines all sort of intersect, but most importantly, we don't have the dead space in between the line and the background. There's a little bit, I'm pointing again, I'm pointing at the screen. Where the arrow is, that's just a small amount of space. The eye can make that jump. The eye, as opposed to back in here where we've got the crash, we have the brighter spot kind of, maybe about an inch or so below, almost 2 inches below the mountains and the highlight in the mountains. And so that's a much harder gap to jump with our eyes than this is over here, where we've got the light. The light goes back into the background. Now we feel this sense of space. We have paths for the viewer to walk through, and then we've got these, this beautiful cloud above us holding the eye in. So I'm trying to pay attention to not only simplicity in lines, but also relationships between different visual elements and how they're playing together to move the eye around the frame, and have viewers really see what I want them to see. I wanted you to see that background. That background, that's beautiful out there in Death Valley. Okay, so as I'm trying to convey depth, one of the things that I run into a lot is mergers. And mergers are when we have a foreground, a midground, and a background that we perceive has space between. We perceive that they're distant. Obviously, this is in Devil's Cornfield. This little corn husk, if you will, is obviously physically separated from the mountains in the background. And when I'm standing, with my camera, I can see that. But what happens with a merger is we're working with a two-dimensional media. And so we have visual elements that end up sort of on top of each other, and mergers actually make me crazy. So this image out in Devil's Cornfield out in Death Valley here, this like literally makes me crazy. And if anybody has ever tried to photograph out in the cornfield, like, it's just an exercise in patience because there's mergers like everywhere. And so in this case, I just had to move a little bit and just reposition. I actually came up a little bit higher with my tripod to get a little bit more separation between that foreground and the foreground plant and then the background. And you can see it's tight, but there's definitely room around that. And again, that's something that you're not going to be able to really resolve after when you get home. So that's why I do my critique in the field, is just to make sure that I'm getting it right there. So the next thing that I'm looking at is the lighting appropriate? And if you saw this image, where's the first place that your eyeball went? My guess is probably the second stripe here where it was brightest. Bright tones tend to grab attention. Darker tones like the blue in the background there, they tend to recede into the background. They don't grab as much attention. I'm going to talk about color here in a bit, but blues tend to be really sort of background colors, not physical background colors, but supporting cast members, if you will, to light. And when I'm out in the field, I really want to make sure that I'm seeing not just light, but I'm seeing light and shadow working together. For me, this image here works because of the light and the shadows working together. You can see texture because of the light, and we've got sort of a side light going on. You can see all that texture in the foreground. You can see texture in the sand because of the lighting. If we had front light, this would be much more difficult to get that texture out. So when I'm out in the field, I want to make sure that I have appropriate lighting, but I also want to make sure that I have shape to my lighting. And so here's an image out in Cotton Ball Basin, and I would ask if anybody's ever made a flat image before, but I can't see you raise your hand. So I have made plenty of flat images before. And so this is an image. Oh yeah, oh no, I get participants raised hands. That's funny. Oh, that's hilarious. I can see you up in the corner. Yeah, it happens, right? And it happens even when you're out in the field and you're doing everything right. Like, so I'm out here in the field and I've got, beautiful side light in the background, right? It's side light. The sun just hasn't come up enough to really put a lot of shape in the foreground. And so one of the ways that you can test for this in the field is you can convert your image to black and white. And especially if you're shooting in RAW, this is a little trick that I do to make sure that I'm seeing the shadows and the light working together, because sometimes I can't always see it in the foreground here. I can see it in the background for sure, but I definitely can't see it in the foreground. And so you can change your picture style. I think some cameras call it picture control, but you can convert it to monochrome. Even if you're shooting in RAW, it will only change the back of it changes the JPEG rendition on the back of your camera's LCD. So you will see the black and white on your screen, but you'll be shooting in RAW. You'll be shooting in color still. But you'll be able to visualize what's going on with your light. And when I change this photograph to black and white, it becomes very clear that this is flat lighting in the front. And what I mean by flat lighting is it just isn't any contrast. There's no blacks, there's no whites. It just looks pretty gray and dull. So for those of you who are trying to pay attention to your histogram would have sort of a hump in the middle of the frame. It would be rich on midtones, and then you wouldn't have a whole lot going on in the highlights and the shadows on either side of your histogram. So what can we do about that? In the field, I just try to get the best image I can. And so in this case, I just knew that I was going to be converting the image to black and white, and I really liked the image in black and white. I just needed to increase the contrast a bit. And so this is where I went with it. And for me, when I think about my visual message for this image, what I really wanted to show was this beautiful sort of random pattern of the salt formations. And when I go back to the previous image in color, like you don't really see that right away. You see the pretty light in the background, which is important. But the reason why I filled, 3/4 of the frame with this pattern is I really wanted you to see it. And in this case, you weren't going to see it. And here, what I've done is really increase the contrast to help you see that foreground. So here's a funny bonus. So I was preparing for the presentation, and I'm trying to pick different images and figure out what I want to say with each one of them. And this is an image actually from 2012, and I had tried to process it back in 2012, and I think this is a really important message for critique. Here's the bonus. This is what I did in 2012 with it. So the important thing is to remember that as we're critiquing our work, our tastes are going to change. I would even throw in our skill levels are going to change. So this was a good attempt, but definitely not what I really wanted to convey when I reprocessed the image. So from a critique perspective, it's okay to keep changing your mind. You can like things on one day and you can not like them the next day. And that's what these two images say for me. When we talk about light, we also want to talk about color and visual weight. And as you saw in the previous sequence, the color wasn't really important. We had orange. If you look, this is the color wheel. If you look, we had the orange, sort of an orangey brown, maybe a little bit of yellow over the foreground, working with some of the, just go back, some of the blues, and it really didn't contribute to my message when I was, really wanted you to focus on the salt formations in the foreground. So we've got an orange that was grabbing attention, and we had sort of this blue in the sky that were creating a juxtaposition between warm and cold. And I didn't really want that to be part of my message. I didn't need that to show the salt formations in that frame. And so that contributed to why I decided to drop the color out and focus on the structure of the black and white and sort of the starkness of the black and white, the grayscale that the black and white offered. So each individual color has a substantial amount of visual weight. And so we have, colors mean different things. And it's not that I can stand in front of the salt flats or the sand dunes and change the color, but I can change the composition based on what colors I'm seeing and how I'm reacting to things. I can also shoot different light. As you'll see in the next couple of frames here in a second, different light, different color can really change the whole meaning of your image. And so, you know, orange is going to be, you know, pretty high energy, hope and happiness. We saw with the sunburst, hope and happiness. And for me, when we're thinking about critique, if we have an image that we want to show more despair, throwing in a whole lot of yellow or throwing in a sunburst, that's going to be a mismatch with your visual message. And so we just want to make sure that everything's lining up with our visual message. And so we've got, you know, blues are a little bit more creative. Red grabs attention. Think of things that are red in our world. We have blood, we have stop signs, we have fire hydrants, things like that. Those are things that we should really be paying attention to. And so they are very high in grabbing attention. They tend to grab that visual weight. They tend to have a lot of visual weight in an image. Green, on the other side, is a lot more peaceful. We tend to associate that from an evolutionary perspective with food and agriculture, and so it's a lot more harmonious, a lot more chill. But, you know, again, we just want to make sure that we're lining up our visual message with what each of these individual colors are. And so I'm going to show you two different, they're pretty close to the same composition. I just want you to think about how each of them makes you feel a little bit. I'll sit on that one for a little bit. And I want you to just be mindful of how it feels when I do this. You feel an energy change? I mean, this is a high energy image anyway because of all the lines, but you can see that the purples and the blues and even sort of the reds are a little bit more dominant. You probably see the background, the sky in this one first. This is at civil twilight. This is before the sun comes up. You can actually see, if you're looking real carefully in the mountains, you can see just a hint of the sunlight in the background, but you probably don't spend a whole lot of time on the foreground. And for me, I wanted you to see these beautiful, not only sand lines going out into the mountains, but also the sideways ones kind of working within each individual one. And so this has a ton more energy. This is a lot, you know, heavier on the yellows, orangey yellow, and you probably spend a lot more time in the foreground than you do in the background, which is the blue. It's receding into the background. And so again, I'm trying to figure out where I want my viewers to look, where I want them to spend the bulk of their time. And you can see by the way that I've composed, you know, 3/4 of this image is sand. You know, I had my camera maybe, you know, 6 inches, 7 inches off of the sand and pointing it down to have that sort of that distortion, that forced perspective. So these look bigger. I wanted you to spend a lot more time there and then go back into the mountains and see the other sand dunes in the background there and the mountains, and then eventually get to the sky. It's just a really different feel and a really different composition with this, which is where you kind of go really fast through the foreground and you end up in the sky. What I think would have made this image a little bit more successful is if the eyeball was going to go to the background, is maybe emphasize the background, tilt the camera up, you know, keep some of this foreground, but maybe put it, you know, towards the bottom third of the image. The other thing is that if I'm trying to convey a little less energy, if I'm trying to convey a sense of peace, even a little bit of mystery, then this is the more successful image than this one. This one is definitely not peaceful. And if you're trying to convey peace with this kind of lighting, it's not going to happen. So again, having that visual message, what you're trying to accomplish, really helps direct what your end result looks like. The other thing with critique is that both of them can be right. They can be right for different reasons. And so again, these two just have really different feelings to them. As we're talking about light and color, once I get my composition sort of done, then I start actually thinking about exposure. And what I'm looking for here is I'm paying attention to my histogram. I want to make sure that it's kind of like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. It's just right. It's not too much light. It's not too little light. In this case, this is overexposed. My camera highlight alert, or the blinkies, would be blinking at me up in the top top left corner of the screen where the sky is blown out. This would be blinking at me. You can see in the histogram below that it is shifted to the right. We've got a spike on the right. And I need to fix that. So this is about a stop overexposed. This is about a stop underexposed. So you can see how the histogram moved. The histogram moved. I changed my exposure to get darker so that I would get a little bit more detail in the sky. That corner now looks actually okay. Doesn't look too bad, but the rest of the image is obviously not successful. This is much too dark. And so what we're looking for when we talk about exposures, we really want to make sure that we're paying attention to our histogram. We don't want to judge our exposure levels based on what's going on in the back of the LCD, because your camera brightness, the screen brightness can change. Just pay attention to your histogram. Your histogram's data. It's not going to lie to you. So this would be an acceptable exposure to me. This is sort of in the middle. There's no spikies on either side of the histogram, but I still don't love that top corner up on the left-hand side there. And so what I try to do in the field is I would use a graduated neutral density filter. In this case, it's a 3-stop, and you can see how the histogram moved just a little bit. And I was able to get a little bit more detail up in that top left corner, but still render a foreground that looked okay to me. And so I definitely want to be mindful of my exposure. And then I'm also checking after I photograph, I'm checking to make sure are things in focus. And there's been some very, very helpful advances in technology that have can help us with keeping things in focus, like focus peaking is one of them, which I rely on quite a bit. But when we talk about what's in focus, is it appropriately in focus? Sometimes we don't want it all in focus. Like in this photograph here, I didn't want the background in focus. It would be too distracting. But in a landscape, generally we want everything to be in focus, which means everything from the foreground to the background. And what that requires us to do is monitor our depth of field. Specifically, it requires us to monitor the hyperfocal distance. There's an app, there's apps out there that you can get that will calculate the hyperfocal distance for you, and that's probably a whole nother presentation. That for me was one of the most challenging things as I was learning photography is trying to figure out what depth of field and what aperture and where I focus and things like that. For flowers, what we want is the pistil or the stamen, the center of the flower to be in focus. Everything else can be out of focus. It doesn't matter. But that center, the pistil or stamen, has to be in focus. That said, if maybe the center is not your subject, your primary subject, then whatever your primary center of interest is should be in focus. I'll show you an example of this in a couple of slides of flowers. And those will be images that are not from Death Valley. So wildlife, we want the eye closest to the camera. People, I guess people could be wildlife too, depending on how wild they are. But wildlife, people, eye closest to the camera. Everything else can be out of focus. And that's why you see a lot of wildlife photographer, people photographers shooting at f8 or wider to help get a little faster shutter speed so that they can freeze the action a little bit better. So the eye, though, has to be with that wider aperture. It has to be in focus. So here's one of my sort of embarrassing screw ups. This is out in Death Valley, and I think what happened in this image, it's blurry. And I think what happened is I forgot that I was shooting on manual focus, and I thought that the camera was doing the work for me. And so when I realized that I was not in autofocus, that I was in fact manually focusing but not manually focusing, I was able to focus a little bit better. So keeping it sharp tips. Be careful of accidental manual focus. Simple enough, right? It happens though, and it happens a lot. So just be mindful of that. There's a couple of camera functions that you can use. You can use the autofocus box and move it around the frame. Autofocus tends to be pretty good with this. You want to make sure that you have areas of contrast, otherwise it won't focus. You'll get the little zoom in, zoom out. And so put it on an area that has a highlight and a shadow, and that will help your camera identify the focus point. You can use live view on the LCD and zoom in. You can use the depth of field preview button if you have it. That was a lifesaver for me back in the film days. It's a great function they still have on the digital cameras. And then a lot of the newer mirrorless cameras are now including focus peaking. And what focus peaking is that when I'm in manual focus, I'm turning my barrel, my camera, my frame sparkles at me. It sparkles yellow, and it tells me exactly where the focus is. So these are all sort of cheats for paying attention to depth of field. Those charts, the app that has the calculation. So that obviously is the more precise way to do it, but focus peaking is like cheating, and it's super fun. It's super nice. Some other things to be careful of in the field with sharpness is if your images are blurry, check your image stabilization vibration reduction, especially if you're on a tripod. What happens with that is that if you're on a tripod, your camera thinks it has to stabilize something, and so it'll start to shake. With my Panasonic, it was really actually quite awful, to the point where I couldn't keep any of the images. If I wasn't paying attention to it in the field, I would literally lose 10, 20 images pretty easy. Just simply not paying attention. With my Olympus, it's a little better. Nikons, Canons tend to be pretty good with this as well, but just be mindful of that. You can take your finger off of the shutter button, use the self timer or cable release or wireless remote, whatever you've got that pulls your finger off the shutter. That will help. And like I said earlier, this is something that I don't roll the dice on in the field. I really make sure that I am sharp before I walk away from a composition. So critiquing, the sharpness using a Hoodman hood loop, which is sort of a loop that fits over the back of your LCD. And I make tiny focus adjustments. If I don't know, I kind of do a CYA, or cover your butt. I make little tiny focus adjustments, and I'll shoot, and I'll repeat it. You can also do focus stacking if you've got a handful of images that you're not sure, and you can move the focus point around. You can stack those. You can blend those in processing later. So when I'm deciding what should be in focus, this really drives my aperture decision. So big number, big depth of field; small number, small depth of field. And so this is obviously not from Death Valley. This is from Thuya Garden in Acadia National Park. And I had started with I think I read either an f/16 or an f/22 with a macro lens, which has an already short depth of field. But I really wanted to showcase the petals, especially in the center of the flower. And I started with f/16, f/22 simply because I thought I would get more of the flower in focus. And when I photographed it and saw this result, I wasn't really that happy with it. And so I changed my aperture, just simply changed the aperture. The focus point was on the pistillary stamen, right in the center of the flower. I didn't change the focus point, I just changed the aperture. And this was more successful for me in terms of blurring that background. Remember when I talked about having a visual message and then eliminating distractions? I'm eliminating this background distraction. I'm getting rid of it. And so I'm bringing the viewer's focus back into the center of the flower. The eyeball, it'll go to the brightest part of the frame, but it definitely does not want to go to places that are out of focus. It's really hard for our eyes to try to focus something that is out of focus. And so we can leverage our aperture setting and our focus placement to really create a sense of depth in this image. You can see this has a little bit more depth than this one does, in my opinion. This feels a little flatter, if you will. I'm using depth. I'm using the out of focus in the foreground to convey a sense of depth. And so the out of focus foreground, we've got a midground that's in focus, and then the out of focus background, that's your three layers. That's your foreground, midground, and background. That's going to create that sense of depth. So I'm asking myself, do I have the right focus point? Do I have the right aperture? Am I conveying the sense of depth that I want to in this image? And while we're on aperture, I thought we can't neglect shutter speed. So this is obviously, again, not in Death Valley. There's just not a whole lot of moving water in Death Valley. So I brought these out to showcase my point here with this. We've got, this is out in Oregon, and I have this nice wide angle frame set up. I've got sort of a sweeping movement from right to left, and what I'm doing, especially with waves, is I'm waiting for the right moment. I'm waiting for the right wave to crash. And this is why when you look at my spreadsheet earlier, I've got a lot of images. When I'm shooting water, I shoot a lot of images, because if you see it happen and you aren't shooting, it's too late. And so for waves, I'll take a sequence, I'll use continuous shot mode, and I'll take a sequence of waves, for example, and I'll try to evaluate each one. So this image, I had the composition sort of down, but now it was just a matter of showing the appropriate motion. This image had just too much energy that I really wanted to crash. I really wanted a bigger wave, something that really was the big payoff for people taking the time to follow this line into the ocean in the background. And one of the things that I noticed as I was waiting for the motion, I was waiting for the right wave, is that I did not like that merge. If that was where the wave was going to crash, that was not where I wanted that to happen, positioned in my frame. And so I actually, in between a series of shots, I actually physically moved. So I created that separation. So that's a merge there that I solved and moved just a little bit over to the right there, and just changed my angle a little bit. You can see the angle is just a little bit different there. But that's the payoff, that sort of energy there, where I've got sort of these funky lines going back into that frame. So I'll ask myself a critique, am I showing the motion that I want? Am I showing the right action? And sometimes I have to wait a little bit before that happens. But that's sort of what I think about in the field when it comes to critiquing my work. And I'm fairly over analytical about it, and I'm fairly anal about things, little things like corners and whatnot. But what I do in processing is I do a quick edit in Bridge when I get home. So I've got these thousands upon thousands of images. For those of you who read Dear Bubbles, you now know how I organize them. But this would be, they're on my external portable hard drive. And now I have to decide, do I have keepers? Do I not? This is where I would be doing, picking out my 5-star ratings and whatnot. I started doing something fairly recent. In my Olympus, I have the ability to lock images. And when I'm in the field and I'm like, yep, that's the composition I want, I've got exactly what I want, I'll actually lock it in my camera. And so I would check that with your camera, your different camera brands. If you have the ability to mark your image, that makes it really easy for me to find in when I have these thousands of images. In this case, I had 720, but when I have thousands and I'm trying to figure out which wave picture is the one out of 4,000, having that lock really helps me find the appropriate image. But one of the things, we want to try to stay as objective as possible when we're talking about critique. And here's a little trick for you to show that our eyeballs, they play tricks on us. So yeah, so put your hand over that center, your finger over the center, and you can see that those two blocks are in fact the same shade of gray, even though they look, the top one obviously looks darker, and the lighter one on the bottom obviously looks lighter. And it's because of the different backgrounds. So the reason I show this is your background in Photoshop or whatever processing you're using, Lightroom, Photoshop Elements on one, whatever it is, it matters. I made the mistake for a long time using a black background for my processing, and it was because I thought that it would help me see light better, which maybe my images looked better, um, but they would always print dark, and I could never figure it out. I thought I was paying attention to the histogram, but I just wasn't seeing it. So I decided to experiment, and I ended up going to a white background, and that changed everything. From a black background, it obviously changed. It emphasized where the darker areas of the frame were, but I found myself like like being more attracted to the white space on my screen than I was my picture, which is not exactly good when you're trying to critique and process your images. So I have settled on a gray background. So this little light gray background is how I process images. And if I want to try to see, you know, is it too dark, is it too light, I will change it to black and white, just based on this whole cognitive dissonance here that happens with our eyeballs, just to make sure I'm being objective with my analysis. The other thing that you can do to be objective in your analysis when you're at home is you can turn your image upside down. And if it looks good upside down, it probably works right side up. Where this technique for me came from was photographing 4x5 large format. Everything was upside down and backwards. And so I never saw my image right side up until I went to film cameras, 35 millimeter digital photography. I'd always seen them upside down and in 4x5 backwards. And so what that did was it stripped the emotion out of it. It stripped some of those emotional responses that we have to, oh, I'm having this is a moment and I love it. And what it really did is made me focus on the technical aspects, where the lines were going, where the shadows were working together and where they weren't, what the balance of the overall image felt like. You know, was it balanced? Was it symmetrical or asymmetrical? How did it feel? And so in processing, you can do all of the evaluations that we've already talked about in the field. You can do them again, but do them upside down. And that can really help sort of train your eye to look at those technical aspects a lot faster in the field for sure. And so one of the things that I tried to adjust for in processing, specifically, I do this in processing on purpose as opposed to in my camera, is color, is white balance. It turns out that I have a really hard time seeing color. I shoot all of my images on sunny white balance, and that's because it gives me sort of a consistent starting place every time. I don't shoot on auto white balance because the camera tends to bounce things all over. And so I set everything to sunny, and then I bring it into, this is Adobe Camera Raw. And I adjust for the color here. So how I do this is I nuke it. I move my color saturation to 100. And for me, this helps. This gives me very clear, I have too much blue, and not only that, it's cyan, and cyanage is approaching cyan. And for those of you who've been with me, you know that I have issues with cyan. Cyan is sort of like the equivalent of, like, you know, scratching your fingernails across the board. So I look at this image and I say, okay, you know, I don't want to lose the balance, the juxtaposition between the orange and the blue. I just need the balance to be slightly differently. So I move the saturation slider to 100, and then I adjust the temperature and tint to taste. And this is going to change for every image. And so I just get it kind of where I think it looks okay. You're still nuclear. You're still at a saturation 100. So it's going to look a little neon-y, but for me, this feels a little bit better. And once I get to a point that I like, I come back to the saturation slider and I move it back to 0. And for me, this has less of that cyany blue and a nice starting place where I can really emphasize that contrast, that balance between the orange and the blue. And so that's one of the critiques that I'll do in processing is, do I have the right color? And do I have the right color balance, the right white balance, and the color balance working together? Inevitably, there are times where the horizon is straight, and I do be very mindful of this in the field. I try to be, at least, but we all, you know, I'm not a perfect human being. I'm not a perfect photographer. It happens, right? It happens that we have tilted horizons. And one of the things that I used to do in Photoshop was crop. And you do the image rotation and it crops the edges off. And as I've become more mindful with my compositions and getting things right out of the camera, I really, really don't want to crop my image when I get it into processing. And so I use something called the warp tool. Where's my warp? Warp in Photoshop, what happens is I want to duplicate my background, and I do Control T. I do a warp. It's free transform. So you can do Control T, Command T if you're an Apple, Mac user, or you can go into the file folder system or in the menu system and select Edit Free Transform. And when you do that, you're going to get this little, I call it a windshield wiper. I don't know what it is, but it's a warp icon, and you're going to get this grid on top of your frame. Is you're going to get these little blue handle ball things on top of your frame, this grid. And what you can do is move those balls, those handles around until you straighten your horizon out. So for me, this is a little bit of a lifesaver. So I try not to do this in processing, but if you have to, it's there. You don't have to crop the image. It's just real simple. So we've thus far talked quite a bit about technical edits. There are some creative edits, though, that we want to do. Again, I would do this in the field. I just want to make sure that my visual message is being supported by my compositional and technical choices. But when I get home and I have a series of images, I still ask myself, you know, what do I like about it? And I try to keep that, and I keep that image, and what I don't like about the image, and I get rid of those. So when I'm looking at my images at home and I'm trying to decide what to do with them, you know, I'm asking myself, does this tell an interesting story? This is out at Panama Springs, and yeah, for me, it's pretty unusual to see a straight line of rocks that have obviously been there for a while. So for me, this tells a story. I think that's interesting and worth sharing with the world. Does it capture a decisive moment? And we think of decisive moments with people and wildlife, but we have decisive moments in landscape photography all the time. You know, the moments just never going to be the same. And so, do we have interesting light? Is it conveying a feeling or a mood? You know, it's not really that usual. We have low clouds, we have fog in the foreground or in the foothills of Death Valley. That was for me kind of a special moment, and created a really interesting mood. The contrast between the foreground being illuminated in the background, having sort of all this drama going on in the background. And I think most importantly, when we talk about critiquing our work, is the subject interesting for you? And yeah, we want people who look at our images to like it, but we have to like it first. And so if you're looking at your image and you're like, I don't really know what's going on here, like it's probably not something that you want to call a keeper. Like you want to be excited about what you're photographing, what you're communicating with the outside world. For me, I just thought this background looked like a sky, and it's a visual illusion. That's actually the salt flat. Right around down below is Badwater salt flats, and so we're at Dante's viewpoint and we're looking down, and so I thought that the salt flat just had this blue shadow and it looked like sky. And so I loved the visual illusion. Like it was sort of like it would make people wonder like what's going on out there. And so for me, this would be an image I would keep, you know, regardless of technical execution, with the exception of maybe, you know, exposure and focus. Those have to be right, but you know, is it centered, is it not, like all those sorts of things. You know, if the subject is interesting to you, that could very well alone be a reason to keep things. The other thing that we want to think about when we're trying to decide on what images we keep and which ones we don't is we don't want to photograph necessarily for our audience, but we do want to consider what our audience is expecting. And that's especially important for me when I work with magazine editors and whatnot, is trying to match the story, the photographs with the story at hand. And so when you're thinking about what images to keep or which ones to eliminate, understand that different audiences may have different opinions about this. And so to give you an example of this, which 4 pictures best support the story? If you were given the story to illustrate was stand-up paddleboarding on Lake Mead, I'm going to show you some images here, 9 images. Which ones would you pick for your story about paddleboarding on Lake Mead? I wish that I could see you guys, because then you could shout numbers at me. So you guys got numbers? You got numbers in? So which 4 pictures? You got numbers? Okay, so here, and you might pick different ones, but here's the 4 that I picked. Are they the same as yours? So I picked the top left one because it set the scene. I wanted people to see what Lake Mead look like. This is the granite ledges. It's pretty amazing. I wanted you to see a perspective. So the top right corner here. So number 1, and then we've got number 3. Number 3 on the top right here shows a perspective of being on the paddleboard. The one on the bottom, we've got, which one is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 on the bottom left is somebody actually physically paddleboarding, so you get an idea of what the action is. That's actually where the Colorado River and Lake Mead intersect. That's the confluence. It's such a magical spot. That's the line between the river and the lake. And then the one in the center here, I put because this is the context of what stand-up paddleboarding is like. You can see my board off in the distance. I'm in camp. There's a lot of camping on Lake Mead if you're doing water sports. So, you know, you might have picked different ones, and that's awesome. As long as it's deliberate, as long as you have a justification for it, then go for it. So here's another test, pop quiz. Which 4 pictures best support the story geological wonders at Lake Mead? Okay, same exact pictures. Would you pick different ones? All right, you got your 4? Geological wonders. Well, we definitely don't need number 2. That's water. But geological wonders might look something like this. Again, the granite ledges are really special. We've got the interesting light in the cliffs and the mountains back off in Nevada. We've got sort of the fracturing, if you will, in the bottom. And then we've got light of Temple Butte on the right-hand side, bottom right there. Maybe that's the story that we want to tell. And again, those are different pictures than the ones, well, except for the top left one. Here's another pop quiz. Which one photo would you use as wall art? Which one of these photographs would you put over your fireplace? Okay. You got one? You got a vote? Okay, you got to vote on this one because I want to see if anybody votes on number 5. I want to see if anybody wants feet in, but my feet specifically, my feet. Yes. I can't even see the votes, which is sad. I'll have to figure that out for next time. But okay, so you got one. Well, probably one of these would probably work. You know, you're probably not going to put an individual like number 7. You're probably not going to put somebody paddleboarding above your fireplace. I don't know, unless it's a significant other or a memorable moment. You're probably not going to put camping, number 6 over your fireplace. 5, though, I could try and talk you into with my feet, yes. But these might be more appropriate for fine art. But note that the one up top, didn't really fit some of the other purposes. And so when we're critiquing our images, understand that we have different purposes. We may have different purposes for our images, and that different images may fit different ideas. So with that, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So the critiquing your work recap. I just want you to, if there's take anything away, one question. There's a lot of questions that we've gone over. Did what I see and experience come out of the camera? That's going to be most important in trying to figure out, what you like about it, what you don't like about it. Make sure you define your visual message first. That's really that. Everything else hangs on that, and really trying to decide visually what you want to express with the world. And then be mindful of issues and distractions from that visual message in the field. Definitely want to keep repeating your technical and creative edits at home as you do in the field, and then consider your audience. And one of the things, I love about critique is that I learn new ideas every time, whether I'm looking at my own work or I'm looking at, the critique workshops, the workshop critiques that we do. I'm always looking for new ideas and new ways to polish my own skills and my own ways of expressing. And so for me, critiquing is a way to continually learn about yourself, your craft, and how you want to interpret this fabulous world of ours. So don't waste a good mistake. We all make them. It happens, and don't get frustrated with the things that aren't working. Try and learn from it if you can. Try and really put that mistake to use, and really try to learn and grow from it. So With that, I'm going to shamelessly self-promote before I take questions. If you liked the presentation, you'll love the workshops. I know it's a really weird time right now. You know, a lot of travel is being canceled. Um, I'm going to keep my fingers crossed that we have things under control by the summer. I have 2 workshops in the summer that do have openings: the rafting on the Grand Canyon, and then the Lake Powell Geography. If you guys want to join me on either of those, if you register by April 2nd, you can get 10% off. You can use Critique 2020 at checkout as your discount code. I will have that in the follow-up email to you. After the webinar, I think it's set to go out tomorrow. So if you forget it or don't write it down, you can still it'll come out. So I do have wait list for other workshops, and I'm already starting to work on 2021. So hopefully we still have the chance, we still have the opportunity to get out and put these things to practice in the field in the future. So we also have some guidebooks: Wild in Arizona for wildflowers, for wildlife, and then Photographing Acadia National Park. Those are all physical books. They also come in ebook form, so if you want to get ready for future travel, pick up a copy of one of those at analemmapress.com. Analemma Press is my publishing company. That's where I do my books. So I also have an instructional Seeing the Light and Outdoor Photography book, and that's going to be much more how to see natural light, how to incorporate natural light, shape, dimension, quantity, quality, anything you want to know about light is in the ebook. So you can pick up all those at analemmapress.com. And then finally, hopefully you guys have had a chance to read through Dear Bubbles. Dear Bubbles is my advice column on photography, art, and the creative life, and it covers a wide range of topics. And I've just been loving the questions that you guys have been submitting. This only works if you guys submit questions, so keep those questions coming. They're great. There's no stupid question at all. Definitely would love to hear what you guys are concerned about or challenged about. And hopefully Dear Bubbles can help. So with that, we're going to do questions. Let me see how I can do this. Let me see if I can see. Oh, here we go. Da, 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 da. Oh, okay. So we do have some questions here. Anne Marie has asked, why was my keep ratio so high in Milwaukee? Right, Anne Marie? It was, I think it was right around 7%. And I had a workshop at a beautiful museum that was right on the water, and I can't remember the name of the museum, but it was absolutely stunning. The architecture was so amazing. It just really, yeah, it was just something I had never seen before. And so I didn't make a whole lot of images, but I ended up keeping a whole lot of them. So it was just from that one museum right on the water. So, okay, so we've got another one from Bruce. With your first 3 photos, did you realize which you liked best while out in the field or only back at home? I'm going to go back to those really quick. It's a great question, Bruce. I realized on those first 3 photos, I actually photographed my message first, and you'll see, if you're being mindful with the light, you can see which ones I photographed first. Let me go back. These first 3 photos here. Let me can I move the question and answer out of the way here? So of these first 3, you'll notice that the light here is less. This is at sunrise. And so this was the first photograph that I made in the field. And I was trying with these other ones, you can see how the light changed and the light changed here. You can see that I was trying to make sure that that was really my focus, that I really, 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 really was sure that I wanted that relationship between the 2. And so in fact, this is the one that I photographed first. So I hope that answers your question. Margaret, what if you upped the contrast on the color version? Yeah, and I'm assuming you're talking about this image here. Let's go back to this one here. Yeah, you definitely could increase the contrast. Here, you could do a similar sort of work. You could wait for different lighting. Anything it takes to get that that sort of contrast, that highlight and shadow, that separation in tone, just so it didn't look so flat. And so we've got, you could increase the contrast. I think the reason why I decided to not do that is I decided that the color, the blues and the oranges were not helping me. And so that's why I went out. So you can definitely, um, both would be right answers at that point. So, okay, so let's see. Bruce, let's see, adjust temp and tint to taste. There are many combinations. Yes, indeed. There's, I haven't calculated, but yes, there are lots of options. What is my process or procedure for adjusting? It literally just is whatever looks good to me. And it's whatever looks good to you. I pull those sliders back and forth, and you'll see that purple is not really that pleasing in a composition. You'll see it, especially if you're on that saturation of plus 100. It's so nuclear that it becomes, at least in my mind, it becomes very, very obvious. Yeah. So let's see, what else do we got? What camera? Ron is asking, what camera and lenses do I use? I use an Olympus OMD EM1 Mark II. I had to practice that. And I have 4 lenses with that. It's a mirrorless, and it's a micro 4/3, so it is not full frame. It is very, very light though, and I absolutely love it. I have a 7-14, a 14-150, a 60 millimeter macro, and a 300. And all of those have a 2x magnification or aspect ratio adjustment. So I have a super wide is the 14-28 equivalent, and a 28-300 equivalent, a 120 millimeter macro equivalent, and then a 600 millimeter fixed equivalent. So I absolutely love it. I definitely love it. So hopefully that helps. Let's see, I've got another question from Stephanie. Stephanie, for that DV with water, title for that DV with water flat shot. Oh, is it this one? Is it maybe this one? This one for me actually looked like a dinosaur back. I don't know that I had an actual title for it sort of worked out, but it looked like dinosaur scales to me. It looked like dinosaur skins, if that makes any sense. I hope that's the right one that you were asking about. So I'm gonna jump out of this because I have no idea what's going on. I'm gonna stop sharing the presentation. I'm gonna see if I have anyone here. Do we have any other questions? Okay, so if there aren't any other questions, I think what we'll do is we'll close this for today. I am super excited. Hopefully this worked. Hopefully the recording worked. And I so much appreciate your time. And you're going to get a questionnaire from me. You're going to get an email from me. I think it's tomorrow. I think it's scheduled for tomorrow. The webinar software I'm still trying to work out, but it was tomorrow. Let me know how this worked for you guys. Like, was it good? Did you learn something? Give me some ideas for next time. And I think, assuming that you guys loved it, I would love to do more of these, especially right now at this time. I think I think we all just need to connect. We just need to connect in a different way. So I'm working on expanding my capacity. You guys were the first 100. You're like my guinea pig. So thank you for being so patient with me. I have about 250 people on the wait list for an encore presentation of this. So I'm trying to figure out expanded capacity so that we can put more people in the room at one time, and maybe try and figure out how to do a little bit more interaction with you guys. And I'm going to keep my fingers crossed that this recorded. If it did, I will send you the link to the webinar recording in a newsletter. I'll get it to you somehow. We'll figure it out. So with that, I hope everybody has a wonderful night. And again, thank you. I hope you are well. I hope you stay wild in this time and stay safe and healthy. to you and all of your family and friends. So we will see you next time. Thanks, everybody.